Hello there, my name's Josie Duplin and I'm going to be teaching you Old Testament this term. I'm really looking forward to meeting you on January 6th and to us exploring the Old Testament together. In this first commentated PowerPoint, I'm going to be talking about reader response criticism, which is a way of interpreting the Bible through our own experience. And I'm going to start with something I'm sure you've seen before. It's from a document called Preparing to Preach. And here at the top it says that the first thing we do when we start this process is to ask, who am I and where am I in life as I come to this reading and begin to prepare this sermon? And asking that question, who am I and where am I, is going to be how we start thinking about this way of reading the Bible called reader response criticism. So, who are you? Are you male or female or gender non-conforming, white or black, young or old, rich or poor, a native of the place where you live or someone who's come from somewhere else? Here's the theologian Ken Stone, who points out how important it is that we recognise how different readers, shaped in diverse ways by the interaction of such variables as religious tradition, gender, national origin, race and ethnicity, socioeconomic class, political affiliation, and a host of comparable social factors, attribute multiple and even contradictory meanings to the same Bible stories. In other words, we disagree about the Bible. We read the Bible differently from one another because we're different people with different theological positions and different life experiences. You are who you are, an embodied person with a particular history. You have a particular age and gender, ethnicity and sexuality. You have a particular socioeconomic status, set of political beliefs, education, state of health, and religious denomination. There might be other things you could mention that are very much part of who you feel you are. And as you sit down to prepare your sermon, you might be sad or angry or despondent, or you could be feeling joyful and optimistic. You might be distracted or short of time or full of cold. And all of those things will affect how you read a given text. Just think for a moment about how different people react to the same film or how your own response to a film has changed over time. That will perhaps help you to see what I'm getting at and why reader response criticism matters. It's about how I might see something you can't in a text, but I might miss other things. I might learn a lot from listening to how you see it. You might broaden my view of it. So here are some good questions we should always be asking ourselves. What can I see here that other people might not understand? What might I be missing? Who could help me to see this in a different light? This is really important for us as preachers because we're always making a sermon in partnership with others and we all read the Bible differently. We're preaching to people whose reading of the text may differ widely from our own. They may have alternative readings or perhaps resistant readings. A resistant reading of a text is one which challenges a dominant, that is, a generally accepted reading of a particular text, or one that challenges dominant cultural beliefs and which reads the text against itself in ways it was not meant to be read. Resistant readings protest against some aspects of the text itself, or what's often called the dominant reading of the text. Perhaps that's not so easy to take in. It might be better to look at an actual example. And one very good example of a resistant reading is the way the early campaigners against slavery reacted against the way many Bible texts had been used to condone the enslavement of people of other races, and the way that the dominant white culture took it for granted that this was right. Now, those Bible texts were written in cultures which took slavery for granted. It is to read against the text, to read it in a way it was not intended to be read, that makes the reading of them resistant. Resistant reading of biblical texts was also crucial for Christians combating segregation in the US or apartheid in South Africa. In my lifetime, for example, the Dutch Reformed Church in South Africa was still using Bible texts to argue that apartheid was God's plan for black South Africans. The dominant reading of those texts was that God sanctioned apartheid. Liberationist readings challenged that dominant reading and have now gained nearly universal acceptance. So let's look at one key way we might respond to the Bible because of how we experience life and God differently, and particularly at readings which challenge dominant interpretations of the Scriptures. And the lens through which I'm going to look at biblical criticism in this talk is gender. And my starting point is going to be feminist biblical criticism. As a woman and a feminist, I'm struck by the fact that the Bible has been written by men in a patriarchal society. And for millennia, it's been interpreted almost exclusively by men, for men, also living in patriarchal societies. In fact, here in the West, the dominant interpretation of the Bible has until recently been formed by scholars and teachers who were almost exclusively both male and white, and who in the main have not seen that as a problem. So here are Rachel Starr and David Holgate on this issue. They say, despite the multifaceted nature of our identity, any one person is only able to read from one place at a time. Yet for a long time, Western biblical scholars, predominantly white men, failed to acknowledge the restricted nature of their readings until liberationist movements, through naming their own location, forced them to recognize their particularity. In other words, they didn't even see that there was an issue. But the rise of feminist criticism has changed all that. So what do feminist critics have to tell us about the Bible? Well, firstly, that in the world of the Bible, female characters are underrepresented in a variety of ways. It's male characters who almost invariably dominate the action. Women usually appear in supporting roles as mothers, wives, and daughters. They're often unnamed, silent, or just missing from the narrative. And none of this has been questioned or seen as unrepresentative by male scholars until recently. One result of that is that the importance of key female figures, such as the Old Testament judge Deborah, has been consistently underplayed. For example, a figure like Mary, the mother of Jesus, has conventionally been interpreted in terms of obedience, girlishness, sexual purity, suffering and motherhood, though all this is very much at odds with some of the stories about her in the Bible. Stories which have been explored with wonderful results by feminist theologians such as Nicholas Lee. Here is Starr and Holgate's summing up of the essentials of feminist readings of the Bible. They write, such approaches seek to honour women's diverse experiences, both within the text and among the community of readers. They demonstrate a greater awareness of the silences within the text and a sustained interest in marginal characters and stories. There is a strong commitment to exposing and challenging violence within texts and interpretations. Perhaps most controversially, Feminist and womanist biblical scholars, including those of faith, are more willing to deny the validity of a biblical text if it is experienced as oppressive. In other words, some feminist critics would go so far as to say that if a text is oppressive to women, it cannot be the authentic Word of God. Now, the last of those may strike you as going too far. But feminist readings are very good at drawing our attention to how the Bible points us to ways in which women, often through cooperating together and being courageous and subversive, help to bring about the purposes of God. Liz Shercliffe's book, Preaching Women, Gender, Power and Pulpit, has many examples of preaching which illustrate the sorts of feminist reading listed by Holgate and Starr. One excellent illustration of the type of feminist reading which succeeds in bringing female characters who may seem marginal out of the shadows and into the limelight is the story of the Hebrew midwives in Exodus 1. They rescue Hebrew babies from death by working together and lying to Pharaoh. And it's interesting to see how the story of these two women links with the courageous and subversive actions of three other female characters in Exodus 2. Moses' sister Miriam, his mother, and Pharaoh's daughter, who work together to ensure that Moses survives to lead God's people out of slavery. And you might add to that list a sixth woman, Zipporah, the daughter of a Midianite priest, who becomes Moses' wife at the end of chapter 2 and saves his life in a strange story in Exodus 4, beginning at verse 24. Without the actions of these women, there would be no Moses to be part of God's rescue of the Israelites. And to take another example, feminist theologians have also resisted the tendency to see God as male. They have emphasized and celebrated language used in the Bible to describe God in female terms. And quite rightly, they've drawn attention to the theological truth that God is without gender. And they've done that by replacing phrases such as God himself with God's self in their own writings, to take just one example. But feminist critics aren't the only ones to take issue with representations of men and women in the Bible. Male theologians and Bible scholars, too, have become increasingly critical of the way men are portrayed in Scripture. So they join with women in rejecting the idea that male biblical characters should be seen as normative for all humans. And they're also resistant to male characters being read as models of masculinity. And also the Bible's frequent portrayal of God as hypermasculine, which I'll return to later. Here are Rachel Starr and David Holgate again. Biblical texts have been used to legitimate certain models of masculinity: the authoritative patriarch, the heroic leader, strong warrior, etc., often through inaccurate, simplistic interpretations of the Bible. The truth is that men don't often recognize themselves in these representations of masculinity. They don't necessarily see themselves as authoritative patriarchs, heroic leaders, or strong warriors. And portrayals of men in biblical narratives are often way more complex than these models suggest. Take the figure of David as a good example. David's mercy towards Saul and his friendship with Jonathan, and that desire he has for peace and reconciliation, they're all good qualities it's easy to admire. But then there's the violence of David. And if you don't think of David as violent, try rereading the David and Goliath story as an adult. Then there's his rape of Bathsheba and his murder of her husband, that's in 2 Samuel 11. And then his failure to deal with his son Amnon's rape of his sister Tamar, that's in 2 Samuel 13, a story that's repugnant to male and female readers alike. And it's not that David's actions are sanctioned by the author of the text. They're not. 2 Samuel 12 makes clear that God is angry at David's treatment of Bathsheba and her husband. And I think David's lack of care for Tamar is starkly portrayed in 2 Samuel 13 and beginning this at verse 20b. So Tamar remained a desolate woman in her brother Absalom's house. When King David heard of all these things, he became very angry, but he would not punish his son Amnon because he loved him, for he was his firstborn. I don't think there's any whitewash of David's action there. So the subsequent idealization of David lies not in these texts themselves, but in the way they've been interpreted down the centuries. We could find another example of toxic masculinity worth exploring in Jacob, a deceitful, cheating son and brother, a very poor husband to Leah, and an uncaring father to all his sons except his two favourites, the children of Rachel. And in class we're going to be looking at Abraham, who wasn't always a fine example of godly living either. Here are Holgate and Starr again. Studies of masculinity within the Bible text might help us to resist normalizing maleness and masculinity within either the text or our own contexts. They might help us to ask questions about gender roles and relationships. They should certainly invite us to challenge readings of the text that portray Abraham, David, and Paul as uncomplicated heroes of the faith. It's better to allow such characters to be flawed individuals who wrestled with their own gender identity and role, as we as readers might also. Finally, they might help us to explore some of the challenges facing men today, including in some Western societies, issues such as poor mental health, loneliness, and violence. In another book, Rachel Starr has looked at marriage metaphors in the book of Hosea through the lens of work on preventing domestic violence. And she reads these husband metaphors as representing God as a male perpetrator of domestic violence. She writes, "In these prophetic texts, God performs masculinity through violence. Reading these texts alongside research concerning male perpetrators of domestic violence, the process of rehabilitating this husband God appears complex. The jealous husband must learn to communicate in a way that is mutual and respectful. He must stop enacting sexual and physical violence. He must develop his awareness of both others and himself." Well, that's a very radical and perhaps shocking way of interpreting the scriptures and writing about God. But what is certainly true is that Hosea can make very uncomfortable reading for both women and for men. And that common biblical idea of a jealous God, expressed as it is in Hebrew with overtly sexualized language, is, for me anyway, uncomfortably reminiscent at times of the abuser's excuse, "I couldn't help myself. It's because I love you so passionately." Well, you may find that sort of interpretation a step too far. Perhaps you'd like to read Hosea and make up your own mind about it, but I'm sure we can all agree that there are lots of things here to think about before we meet on the 6th. There are also some tasks for you to do before you come to class that you can find on Moodle. I very much look forward to meeting with you on the 6th.